The Secret of the Underground Room by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. Johnny was too scared to scream. He sat bolt upright in bed, rigid with terror. His mouth was open and his jaw trembled. Many minutes passed before he was able to turn his head and stare directly at the fearful shape. But it was gone. In its place, on the seat of the cane-bottomed chair, lay something shiny. Quickly, Johnny lurched to his right and clicked on the lamp that stood on his bedside table. Then he fumbled for his glasses and put them on. He turned back to the chair, and what was lying there? A teaspoon. The handle was shaped like a bearded man in a long robe, and under the man's feet was a tiny pedestal labeled Thomas. Tied to an ornamental loop at the top of the spoon was a price tag. But the price on the tag had been crossed out, and instead these groups of letters had been scrawled on the cardboard. SNCUSB. Johnny's head was whirling. He still had not gotten over his fright, and now he had to puzzle over this object that had been left on his chair. What did it all mean? Was Father Higgins dead? Johnny read a lot, and he had heard stories of how ghosts of living people sometimes appeared to their friends to warn them or ask for help. To ask for help. Johnny's head was beginning to clear, and this seemed to be the most likely explanation for what he had just seen. The last time he had talked to Father Higgins, the poor man had been up to his ears in trouble. But if he was asking for help, what kind of help did he need? Johnny sat on the edge of his bed for a long while, turning the funny little spoon over and over in his hands. Then sleepiness came over him, and he felt his eyelids beginning to flutter. With a sigh, he laid the spoon back on the chair, took off his glasses, and snapped off the light. In the morning, he would talk to the professor, and together they would figure the mystery out. Johnny laid his head on the pillow and slid off into deep, delicious sleep. The next day was Saturday. Usually on Saturdays, Johnny had a long, leisurely breakfast of pancakes and sausage prepared by Grandma. But today he wanted to skip breakfast altogether and tear over to the professor's house to tell him about the things he had seen last night. Unfortunately, he couldn't do this. Grandma would have been disappointed. So Johnny fought down his impatience and munched pancakes and tried to chat pleasantly with his grandparents. But his mind was definitely someplace else, and he wondered if either of the two old people would notice this. Grandpa began telling a long story about the time he had visited Utah back in the Wild West days, when there were still gun-toting killers, tough marshals, and blue-jacketed cavalrymen roaming around. He was just getting to the exciting part when they heard a loud knocking at the front door. "My gosh!" exclaimed Grandpa as he got up. "I wonder who that is. Sounds like he's trying to break down the door." "Whoever it is doesn't have the brains to use the doorbell," Grandma said. Calmly, she flicked a pancake on the griddle. You think people would notice where the button is?" she added, walking slowly because of his arthritis. Grandpa went to the door. When he opened it, there stood the professor, looking more disheveled than usual. His glasses were stuck crookedly on his face, and his hair was a mess. He was still wearing his pajama top, which was tucked clumsily into his trousers. His face was red, and he was breathing hard. "Henry!" he gasped, stumbling into the front hall. There's never been a... I mean, how?" After giving Grandpa a very wild, confused glance, the professor brushed past him and headed straight for the kitchen. When he got there, he stopped in the middle of the floor and just stood still, breathing heavily, and looking from Johnny to Grandma and back to Johnny again. Johnny was alarmed, and he jumped up from his seat. What is it, Professor?" he exclaimed. The professor closed his eyes, and with a struggle, he pulled himself together and slumped into a chair. Folding his hands on the kitchen table, staring hard at the sugar bowl, he began to talk in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice. "Father Higgins has disappeared," he said. "I just got a call from his housekeeper. He didn't show up to say Mass this morning, so people got worried and they went over to his house. And it was totally empty. No Father Higgins anywhere. Search parties are out looking for him in the woods near Rock's Village, and... Here the professor paused, then choked back a sob. "And they are even dragging the river." Johnny turned pale and swallowed hard. He had seen the ghost of the dead Had he seen the ghost of the dead Father Higgins? Or had he seen something else? More than ever, he wanted to be in some private place so he could talk with the professor. Grandma and Grandpa were nice people, but they didn't believe much in ghosts and specters and things that go bump in the night. Grandma clucked and said sympathetic things, and Grandpa asked a lot of questions that the professor couldn't answer. Then silence fell. The kitchen clock buzzed, and you could hear children playing at the end of the street. "I wish I could think of something to do," said the professor in a dull, despairing voice, "but I can't. We'll just have to wait and see if the poor man shows up. I have a full load of classes and meetings today, but I'll go down to the church and say a prayer for him tonight." "Can I go down with you?" said Johnny suddenly. The professor turned and stared curiously at his young friend. The two of them knew each other very well, and sometimes one would know what the other was thinking without a word being spoken. Instantly the professor guessed that Johnny had something important to tell him, something that he couldn't talk about in front of his grandparents. Why, yes, John, of course you may go down to the church with me," said the professor in a stiff, formal voice. "I don't always believe that lighting candles and praying will solve things, but I don't suppose it will hurt any. Shall we say 8 o'clock? That evening, Johnny and the professor were sitting in one of the front pews at St. Michael's Church. The smell of incense still hung in the air from an earlier service. As clearly as he could, Johnny told the old man about what he had seen last night. The professor listened intently and nodded gravely or shook his head every now and then. When he had finished his talk, Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out the spoon. Without a word, he handed it to the professor. Thoughtfully, the professor turned the shiny object over in his hands. After what seemed like a long time, he spoke. "So this is what he left?" he asked. Johnny nodded. "Yeah, Professor. What do you think it means?" The professor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, to begin with," he said, "this is what they call an apostle spoon. People used to buy them in sets and hang them in wooden racks on their dining room walls. Each of the 12 spoons had a handle that looked like one of the 12 apostles who followed Jesus. This one is Thomas, as it should be, since that is Father Higgins' first name." "What about the tag, Professor? What do those letters mean?" The professor smiled faintly. "You know," he began, "it's funny what you remember from high school chemistry. These are symbols for 3 elements. SN stands for tin, Cu copper, and SH and SB antimony. They're all metals. Beyond that, I don't have the faintest idea why Higgy would have given you that spoon with the tag on it." There was a long silence. Johnny stared at the red sanctuary lamp that cast weird shadows across the church's altar. "Do you think he's alive?" he asked in a weak, throaty voice. "Father Higgins, I mean?" The professor twiddled the spoon back and forth between his fingers. "Yes," he said firmly, "I honestly do. You were right when you said that ghosts of the living sometimes appear to people, and when you think about it, why would Higgy appear to you and leave mysterious messages if he were dead? No one could help him then, so I think we have to believe that he's trying to contact us. But I don't know if there's anything we can do. We just don't have enough to go on. I'm going to call up a friend of mine tonight. He's a chemistry prof at Hagstrom College, and he might know if there's any connection between the 3 metals that are listed on that tag. And now let's say a few prayers for our friend, shall we?" Johnny nodded, and the two of them walked up to the communion rail, knelt down, and prayed for Father Higgins. And that is the end of chapter 3.